Good evening, Cubs. It seems that it's time for another story for you. This one is a bit long, not quite as long as the facts of the case of M. Voldemar, but considering the current climate of the world right now, this might be an appropriate story. At least it was last year. The Masque of the Red Death. Again, by Edgar Allan Poe. The Red Death has long devastated the country. No disease had ever been so fatal or so hideous. Blood was its signal and its seal, the redness and the horror of blood. Each of its victims felt sharp pains and sudden dizziness, and then bleeding at the pores. The scarlet stains on the victim's body, especially that of the face, were the warning that shut him out from all aid and sympathy. No more than half an hour had passed since the Red Death's first attack, and the victim's grim death rattle. Prince Prospero was happy and fearless and clever. After half of his subjects had died of the Red Death, he summoned 1,000 healthy and light-hearted friends from among the knights and ladies of his court. With these followers, he left for the deep seclusion of one of his giant castles. This castle was a magnificent structure, the creation of the prince's own unusual tastes. A strong, high wall with iron gates protected it, and the prince's followers, having entered, used furnaces and massive hammers to weld the gates shut. They resolved to keep themselves in and everyone else out. The castle had plenty of food and supplies. With such precautions, the prince's followers could defy the disease. The outside world could take care of itself. In the meantime, it was foolish to grieve and to think. The prince had provided all that was needed for pleasure. There were jesters, there were actors, there were ballet dancers, there were musicians, there was beauty, there was wine. All of these and security were inside. Outside was the Red Death. Toward the end of the 5th or 6th month of this seclusion, and while the plague raged furiously throughout his lands, Prince Prospero entertained his 1,000 friends at the magnificent masked ball. It was a luxurious scene. First, let me tell you of the rooms in which it was held. There were 7 rooms, all in a row, and all were strangely decorated to fix the prince's love of the bazaar. Each of the adjoining rooms had 3 high Gothic windows to the right, the left, and in the middle of each wall. The windows looked out over the hallway that led to each room. These windows were in stained glass, the color of which matched the main color of the room. At one end of the castle, for instance, was a mostly blue room, and vividly blue were its windows. The second chamber had purple decorations and purple glass. The third was green throughout, as were its panes. The fourth was furnished and lighted with orange, the 5th with white, and the 6th with violet. The 7th room was shrouded in black velvet tapestries that hung all over the ceiling and down the walls, falling in heavy folds upon the carpet of the same material and color. In this chamber only, the color of the windows did not match the decorations. The panes here were scarlet, a deep blood color. In the hallway outside each window there stood a giant tripod that held a wide, shallow metal bowl. In each bowl was a blazing fire. Thus, the rooms were glaringly lit. But in the black chamber, the effect of the firelight that streamed through the blood-tinted panes was ghastly. It produced a wild look upon the faces of anyone who entered, though few dared to do so. In that same chamber, a gigantic ebony clock stood against one wall. Its pendulum swung to and fro with a dull, heavy, monotonous clang. When the hour struck, there came from the brass lungs of the clock a sound that was clear and loud and deep and musical. But it was so peculiar a note that each hour rang out, the musicians of the orchestra were forced to stop their music and listen to the sound. The party guests were also forced to stop their waltzing, and there was a brief uneasiness among the light-hearted company. While the chimes of the clock rang, even the cheeriest person grew pale. People who were more aged and thoughtful passed their hands over their brows as if in confused meditation. When the echoes had finally ceased, everyone broke out once again in gay laughter. The musicians looked at each other and smiled in whispering vows to each other that they would ignore the next chiming of the clock. After another 60 minutes passed, however, there came another chiming of the clock, and there was the same uneasiness and meditation as before. In spite of these things, it was a jolly and magnificent party. The prince's peculiar tastes had dictated the sort of costumes his party guests wore. There were much ghostly glare and glitter. There were oddly shaped figures with unusual limbs and features. There were the delirious touches of a madman. There was much of the beautiful, much of the bizarre, something of the terrible, and a great deal that could cause disgust. It seemed as though the 7 colorful chambers where the party was held were stocked by dreams that drifted in and about, taking color from the rooms and causing the orchestra's wild music to seem like the echo of their steps. And always there was the hourly strikes of the ebony clock. At those times all was still, all was silent except for the clock. The dreams went stiff, frozen as they stood, until the echoes of the chime died away. They lasted but an instant, then a light laughter floated after them, and they departed. Through it all, none of the masqueraders went into the black room, for as the night slipped away, the bloodier light flowed through the scarlet window panes. The blackness of the curtains was appalling. The other rooms were crowded, and in them the heart of the life of the party beat. The party went whirling on until finally there began the sounding of the midnights upon the clock. When the music stopped, as I have said, and the waltzers grew quiet, there was an uneasy end of all things as before. At the same time, many party guests noticed a masked figure who had caught no one's attention until now. The rumor of this new presence spread around, creating a buzz of whispers. At first, people were surprised, then disapproving, but they quickly became repulsed and terrified. In an assembly of ghosts such as I have described, no ordinary costume could have caused such a sensation. But this figure had gone beyond the bounds of even the prince's strange designs. It was tall and hungry-looking, and shrouded from head to foot in the clothes of the grave. The mask that concealed the face looked so much like a stiffened corpse that it was impossible to figure out where the mask began and ended. Yet all of this might have been endured, if not approved, by the wild party guests around, but for one thing. The masquerader had gone so far as to imitate the symptoms of the Red Death. His clothes were dabbed in blood. His brow and all his facial features were sprinkled with the scarlet horror. When the eyes of Prince Prospero fell upon this ghastly image, his guests saw him shudder with either terror or distaste. In the next instant, his face reddened with rage. "Who dares?" he demanded coarsely of his followers. "Who dares to insult us with this mockery? Seize him and unmask him, that we may know whom we have to hang at sunrise." Prince Prospero stood in the blue chamber as he uttered those words. His words rang throughout the 7 rooms loudly and clearly, for the prince was a bold and robust man, and the musicians and every guest had become hushed at the waving of his hand. Such a bold and clear command, no one put forth the hand to seize the intruder. Instead, he walked slowly and deliberately past Prince Prospero. The masquerader then passed within a yard of the prince, but the vast assembly of guests shrank away from the centers of the rooms towards the walls. The newcomer strode uninterrupted. He moved deliberately and solemnly through each chamber until he had almost reached the final one of black. It was then, however, that Prince Prospero became maddened with rage over his own momentary cowardness. He rushed towards the masquerader, following him through each of the rooms. No one followed the prince on account of the deadly terror that had seized all. Prince Prospero held a dagger over his head as he approached the figure within 3 or 4 feet. But just as the masquerader reached the black chamber, he turned suddenly and faced the pursuing prince. There was a sharp cry, and the gleaming dagger dropped upon the black carpet. Instantly afterward, the Prince Prospero fell dead beside it. Summoning the wild courage of despair, a throng of the prince's followers threw themselves into the black chamber and seized the masquerader. They gasped in unspeakable horror when they found that the grave clothes and corpse-like mask they had handled so violently were empty. Now everyone understood that they were in the presence of the Red Death. He had come like a thief in the night. One by one, he dropped the party-goers in the blood-dabbled halls of their revel, and the life of the ebony clock went out, and the flames of the huge tripods went out, and darkness and decay and the Red Death held absolute power over all. Well, Cubs, there's your story for tonight. I could comically say, remember, cover your mouth, wash your hands, wear a mask if needed. But let's not make it political, shall we? Anyway, rest well. You've had your glass of water. You've had your story. Don't go to bed, my cubs. Curl beneath your warm covers and dream. For tomorrow you will wake up and it will be another day. I do hope that you have pleasant dreams. Good night, my cubs.